My husband's mother muttered, "You will always be mine first, not hers," as she danced with her son at our wedding reception. Nodding, he grinned. "We should show everyone the wedding present you two got me," I added, taking up the microphone. Upon realizing the reality, their grins began to fade. A beautiful historic site in Savannah, Georgia, was the site of our wedding. Such a spot would have an aura of old money elegance with its exposed brick walls, darkly illuminated chandeliers, and the like. It embodied everything that I had hoped for in a wedding, refined and exquisite. On the outside, it seemed like everything had gone swimmingly. It had been 4 years since Brandon and I were dating. He had a way with words, was charming, and could always find the perfect expression. When we first began dating, I believed he was the kindest, most considerate guy I had ever encountered. Weekend getaways were constantly in the works, and he never failed to make me feel like the only person in his universe by surprising me with thoughtful presents. However, his connection with his mother, Margaret, has always been strange. It would have been wise of me to focus more. Margaret had a knack for interjecting herself into our relationship, seemingly seeking assistance at all times. She threatened to contact Brandon with a false emergency if I scheduled a date night, trying to make him feel guilty about staying. If I were to make supper, she would point out to him that no one could match her culinary skills. She would grin tightly and say, "We'll see about that," whenever I brought up the possibility of a future together. Initially, it was little issues that I disregarded. In hindsight, I see how foolish I was. The party was going strong. Everyone was having a good time, from laughing to drinking. With a champagne flute tucked between my fingers, I sat at the sweetheart table and watched the proceedings unfold. When the mother-son dance was ready, the DJ gave the signal. What I was hoping for was something sugary. So it's just tradition, isn't it? Just before the celebration begins, there's a touching moment. On the contrary, I was privy to an experience that turned my stomach. With a self-satisfied grin on her face, Margaret approached Brandon, who eagerly grasped her hand. As a gentle melody began to play, they started to rock back and forth. I saw her leaning in and getting perilously near to his ear with her lips. Something was whispered by her. I couldn't believe it when it happened. But then I saw how he responded. And he grinned. He proceeded to nod. I had a tingling sensation all over. I felt numb all around. In that instant, I realized it wasn't normal, even if I didn't know what she had said. This wasn't a touching reminiscence or a mother gushing over her kid. Something twisted was it. My pulse raced through my body. White noise replaced the formerly distinct sounds of laughing and breaking glass as the environment became more hazy. I was quite interested in her words. To that end, I bided my time. With a smug grin on her face, Margaret was the first to draw away as the song finished, her nails still resting on his shoulder. As if she were his business partner rather than his mother, Brandon patted her palm before turning to get a drink. That is when I realized my opportunity. I got up from my chair and walked up to Margaret, trying not to show any emotion. "What a lovely dance," I said. Her ear cocked to one side, and her pupils widened as if she understood something I didn't. "It was unique," she whispered. I put on an act of agreeing. "So, what were your words to him?" Her grin remained unchanged. It expanded, if anything. "I will always prioritize you above her." It hardly registered. Important notice. Undoubtedly true. She was anxious for me to be aware of it. She was hoping I would be the one to pay attention. She insisted on seeing the exact second my heart broke. As for Brandon, he wasn't only attentive. He concurred. There and then, I should have bolted. I refrained from doing so, however, since I was concealing something from her. It was proven. The idea of letting them off the hook was unacceptable to me. My face remained neutral as I straightened and smoothed my clothing. A sense of victory washed over Margaret. To her, it had been the ideal play. Little did she know that I was going to turn the tables on her. I calmly inhaled, pivoted toward the disc jockey, and seized the microphone. My voice was firm as my pulse raced as I addressed the distinguished audience. "I would like to share a little wedding present that my husband and his mother gave me before the wedding, before we begin the celebration." The sound of laughing subsided. The subject was abruptly dropped. The whole room shifted its gaze to meet me. Brandon stood still beside the bar. Margaret's jaw dropped. I took the remote control out of my bouquet and held it high in my palm. That one that leads to the enormous screen behind us for projection. They seemed lifeless. Everybody in the bridal hall saw the truth as soon as I pressed play. Play was the command I gave. Initially, there was complete quiet. The screen behind me then came on. It was as if someone had vacuum sealed the reception hall, which had previously been alive with laughing. In a state of bewilderment, everyone's gaze shifted to the enormous projection screen situated at the room's front. With his drink in hand, Brandon remained still beside the bar. His cheeks became white. Sitting at the closest table, his mother Margaret's knuckles were white from the tight grasp she had on the tablecloth, because they were aware. What was coming was obvious to them. At that moment, film began to roll. Unbeknownst to them, I had hidden a small security camera and the resulting film was blurry. Suddenly, we weren't even at the wedding anymore as the television flared to life. Our destination was Margaret's residence. In particular, I was in her kitchen, a room I despised entering since she was so good at reminding me that it was hers. There he was, Brandon, leaned against the counter. Seated casually, he had his hands stuffed into his pockets. As if she had an infinite amount of time on her hands, Margaret stood opposite from him, delicately swirling a glass of wine. She talked in the same gentle, sugary tone she used whenever she was trying to manipulate him, telling him that he didn't have to do the task. A heavy sigh escaped Brandon's lips. "This is nothing new, Mom. Would that be correct?" Tilting her head, she issued a challenge. "I really doubt you get it. Things vary once you tie the knot with her. Plus, I'm not sure I'm a fan of it." Brandon shook his head and emitted a little chuckle. "That is not the case. Still, you're mine." Margaret interrupted him as she moved closer. "Do I?" Her wineglass fell on the table as she extended her hand to touch his face. Her fingernails brushed over his cheek, lingering for an extra second. Onlookers in the wedding reception hall let out gasps. My bridesmaids were shy, so a few of them covered their lips. In the video, Margaret's face was really angry. "Feeling peckish. I brought you up. You were created by me." It was a whisper, but she knew you better than anybody. No, she will never. As if this had been their talk before, Brandon let out a loud breath. They acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The most terrible thing followed. Margaret purred, assuring him that he would always come first. Nothing to do with her. My newlywed spouse grinned and nodded on camera as my wedding guests watched. "Sure, I am aware." Everything in the hall exploded. Oh my goodness, low voices. Incredulous by what they were seeing, people moved uneasily, causing chairs to scrape across the floor. Brandon sprang at me. Stepping back, I raised a hand in protest. "Aha, we're not finished yet," I said. Why? Because of this? This was just the first stage. As he clenched his fists, Brandon was gasping for air. "Where did you get that?" he shouted, his voice barely audible. Caution is advised. In a fit of hysteria, Margaret sprang up from her seat. "You cunning little one." I interrupted her. "Take a seat. Lower yourself." My voice pierced the room, albeit it wasn't very loud. A lot of people were still staring at the TV. The video kept cutting since it wasn't over yet. A fresh video, another scene. Upon returning to a hotel room, Brandon once again. Still, he had company. As a lady entered the screen, I could hear gasps from the audience once again. Certainly not I. No, not his mom. Various individuals. Tall and brunette, the lady had an air of easy beauty. Her silk robe and neatly manicured nails made her an attractive woman. I could identify her without a doubt. Brandon's ex. What really gets under my skin is this section. She came up to him, kissed him, and then around his neck. Very much, as if it were second nature to her. All hell broke loose in the wedding hall, crying out. Angry outcry. With her face drenched in blood, Margaret slumped back into her chair. Before returning his gaze to me, Brandon glanced at the television. He tried to speak, but nothing came out of his lips. I redirected my attention to the headset. "And there it is," I said, a token of my affection for the happy couple. My hand slipped from the microphone. An uprising ensued. On camera were a few. I was rushed up to by my maid of honor, who whispered, "Are you okay?" before clutching my arm. Yes, I was. I could make out every detail after 4 long years for the first time. Brandon was more than just unfaithful. He was more than simply his mother's son. For better or worse, he was both. He was going to pay for it, and I was going to guarantee it. No sound. It seemed as if the whole room had come to a complete standstill for that one extended moment. Next, anarchy. "Oh my goodness," chuckles softly. There was a clinking sound as individuals looked at each other in disbelief. A few of the attendees were filming with their cell phones. Many others looked shocked and covered their mouths. As Margaret's jaw clenched and her eyes roved between Brandon and his ex-girlfriend, she seemed to have gone rigid, although Brandon did take action. His arms swung forward in a desperate attempt to grab the microphone, myself, or anything else that may avert this disaster. Still, I was prepared. I took a step back and let the screen to do the talking. Why? Because there was still more footage left to watch. It kept on recording. There was more going on between Brandon and his ex than meets the eye. My goodness, it was far worse. His ex-girlfriend expressed her confusion by running her fingertips down his jaw. You're committing to marrying her, but you keep returning to me. A smug expression spread over Brandon's face. Everything is how it is. Don't worry, she's okay. No risk. Am I in danger? I felt a tightening in my chest and clenched fists at my sides. She just doesn't understand you the way I do, his ex-spouse went on, running a finger down his arm. No, she will never. A deep sigh escaped Brandon's lips. She's only useful. Something exploded in the room. To meet his gaze, Margaret spun around. Her voice quivering, she yelled at Brandon. A moment of paralysis passed over Brandon. Not because he had cheated on her, but because he had chosen someone else above her. His mother's expression was one of horror. She felt her illusion of control over him crumble at this very moment. There was no danger, you stated. Margaret moaned beneath her breath as she clenched his arm so firmly that her claws prickled his flesh. Ripping himself away from her, Brandon's expression contorted. So, are you for real this second? Their enchantment seemed to have evaporated. I saw their demise as their web of deceit and deceitfulness unraveled before the eyes of everyone they had deceived. I had more work to do, however. My attention returned to the visitors. My voice became louder as I said, piercing through the growing tension. Now I understand what you're all thinking. Where did the knowledge to put everything up come from? I had no idea where to put the cameras. Still more murmurs. A greater number of students with wide eyes. So did I. Reason being, there was a final video. The next clip popped up on the screen, so I reached for the remote once again. The display flickered. A different scene emerged. The eatery has low lighting and a secluded eating area with a long wooden table. The shelves in the backdrop were adorned with pricey wine bottles. And there were two individuals, Margaret and Brandon, sitting together. Shock and astonishment swept across the crowd. Brandon shook a whiskey glass in his fist, visibly irritated in the video. He said under his breath that she was becoming too inquisitive. Martha drew nearer. She must be subdued thereafter. In response, Brandon shook his head. Mother, she is not foolish. She will understand in due time. Margaret clutched her wine glass with clenched hands. Then follow in your father's footsteps, she whispered. A swell of terror swept across the audience, the reason being that Brandon's father, Margaret's husband, had passed away. Unintentional vehicle collision. Everyone had been informed that, at least. In the video, Brandon let out a strong breath. What a change, he said, Margaret said in a quiet voice. Could it be? Room detonated. Margaret lunged forward, attempting to switch off the projector while screaming. However, my bridesmaids were standing in her way. Brandon's expression shifted to one of extreme fear. As a result, the truth was now known by everybody. His mother had already removed his father and contemplated doing the same to me. My spouse was a liar and cheat. Nothing except a chilling, piercing stillness washed over me as I turned around to face them. Now, I said while cocking my head, is anybody interested in giving an explanation? Margaret looked around the room like an animal in distress, and her breathing was labored. She hadn't gotten used to being the center of attention. Like he had lost touch with reality, Brandon stood there immobile. With his hands shaking uncontrollably at his sides, his face seemed lifeless. The murmurs became cries. Could it be true? Did she just confess to murdering her spouse? Oh my goodness, I don't know what's up with them. Letting the gravity of the situation settle in, I stood erect with my microphone held aloft. Margaret became angry at that point. With a look of pure animosity on her face and a quiver in her voice, she looked across at me. Beat Sage, you cunning little thing! Astonishingly, the audience gasped. A few folks took a step back. Some took a stand, prepared to step in. Her comments made Brandon cringe, but he refrained from defending her this time. A low-volume giggle escaped me. At peace, managed effectively, deadly. Do you dislike it when individuals see reality? I stated. Margaret clasped her hands. At last, Brandon discovered his voice. Oh my, he stutters. This isn't what it seems to be. He immediately stopped talking since I betrayed him so quickly. I wasn't really. Which section, Brandon? I tilted my head and asked. That point when you concede authority to your mother? Remember when you betrayed me? That? Or the time we were both sitting at a restaurant and she plotted my accident? Similar to a fish panting for oxygen, his lips moved back and forth. Margaret smirked and pointed a trembling index finger in my direction. You screwed up every single thing. Despite your inflated sense of intelligence, you have no idea how this family functions. Interjecting, I believe I comprehend fully. You managed your husband's behavior, and you terminated his employment as soon as he stopped listening. I shifted my attention to Brandon. What about you? The person after you was you. Coming up next, a little puppet. When Brandon understood what I was saying, his expression contorted in dread. I was there when he felt it. Shh, he whispered. I saw a new expression in his eyes. Fear. I am not afraid you will leave me. I don't care if I seem foolish. A dread of hers. Margaret's look became unintelligible as her face became icy. I looked around at the people who had gathered here to celebrate the wedding, my friends, his family, and my own, and saw what seemed like something out of a crime documentary. I said in a firm voice that you all noticed it. My whereabouts will be known to you in the event that anything were to happen to me. It was forced laughter, but Margaret managed to let out a piercing one. She told him that he thinks he is very smart. However, your story will go unbelieved. My eyebrow was arched. They have just seen the film. Affirmative, they do. Her head spun as she frantically scanned the room. The cameras were apparent to her at that moment. Filming individuals, capturing audio, online video streaming. This had escalated beyond a simple family dispute. There was proof of this. Out of nowhere, Brandon sprang forward and grabbed my wrist. I implore you, he murmured. My dear, you have no idea. She refuses to release me. So yet she hasn't. No, she will never. And I had a glimpse of genuine fear in his eyes for an instant. The matriarch attending his own wedding celebration. He begs me to save him. I don't do it. Coming from her. Margaret's anger was evident as she clenched her fist over her wine glass. Little guy, you're weak, she shouted at him. Is it her intention to provide you a hand? You had your life shattered by her. It was as if Brandon had been scorched as he released my wrist. Afterwards, Margaret did something to the audience that will be etched in my memory forever. As if to smack him, she lifted her hand. On this occasion, however, he did more than stand there. He snatched her wrist in midair. Quietness descended onto the chamber. With a trembling body, Brandon gazed at her. With his voice barely audible above a whisper, he said that you no longer have authority over him. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She seemed terrified for the very first time. The last strike followed. Here we find the true twist. A member in the audience rose to their feet. A guy, more senior, dyeing hair. Not new. Ghost whiteness enveloped Margaret. Because there was a guy who ought to have been dead standing before her, fully conscious and alert. Married to her. The father of Brandon. She had purportedly laid him to rest many years ago. Oh my goodness. A hushed murmur. A little filming. With a firm grasp on the chair next to her, Margaret staggered backwards. Who are you? Her voice quivered. Unreadable expression on his face, Brandon's dad peered down at her. Surprised. Margaret was immobilized. I looked across at Brandon. His body trembled, and his eyes widened in surprise. Hey, Dad. After much ado, his father turned to face him. He said that he intended to arrive earlier, but I had to check that I had documentation for everything. Falling onto the chair, Margaret slumped. No sound, fallen victim. Let me tell you something. Her spouse had not been murdered by her. In order to get away from her, he had pretended to die. He had returned after years of hiding. To complete the task I had begun, authorities were alerted. For the years of unearthed fraud, abuse, and control, as well as the threats directed on me, Margaret was forcibly removed while wailing. Who is Brandon? As he watched, everything crumbled around him. If I felt sorry for him, I can't say for sure. Alternatively, just alleviation. I was aware of one thing, however. I was never going to take over for his mom. It was quite clear that I would not serve as his fallback option. With his trembling voice and blurry eyes, he muttered, "Can we talk?" So did I. Grasped the train of my bridal gown. He then got up and left. Why? Because of this? I no longer had any interest in this. This marriage was nullified by me. Brandon likely escaped the rubble of his family's destruction by moving far away. Hey there, Margaret! In the end, she found her true home. As for me, I began again. Everything is calm. Nothing hidden. There are no insane in-laws. Only tranquility. To be completely honest, it was the most selfless thing I could have done for my wedding.